So everybody, welcome to the second online version of the AWS Portsmouth user group. Steve Viens, Chris Planke, and myself are the co-organizers of this little fiasco. Thank you all for showing up. If you want to connect or if you want to chat with us, please, you can Twitter us, you can at AWS Pug. We have the website up. On there, you can get access to the Slack channel. If you want to sign up for the meetups, feel free to go to meetup.com/AWSPug. Or if you have questions in here, you can speak up or just add something to the chats. So that's it for the housekeeping rules. Please mute your mic when you're not talking to. We appreciate that. So a little bit about tonight. So I was reading this book, Python for DevOps, which is a fantastic book, by the way. I highly recommend it. And I don't know why I do this, but I do the author thank yous and the acknowledgements and everything like that. And as I was going through it, somebody was being very effusive about Wes Novack. And so I decided to learn a little bit more about him. So I went onto Twitter, I started cyber stalking him. And I asked him if he would come to our tiny little pug and do a presentation, because in the acknowledgments they talked about all of the stuff that he does and the presentations and the user groups and the cons that he goes to. And I looked at his videos and I was like, oh, that's amazing stuff. We got to have that. So Wes, thank you for coming on to our little pug tonight. Everybody can read, so I'm not going to read that out loud. So what I will do is I will stop sharing, admit the rest of the people that are in the waiting room that are still there, and kick over the share to you, sir. And the floor is yours.
Sounds good. Thank you. Let me get my sharing set up here. We can get going.
For the people who are not as socially connected as you, Chris, maybe you can introduce Wes, where he's from, and does he work for Pluralsight, etc.
Yes, we can do. Well, I'm assuming that Wes is going to do that himself. So
yeah, I can give a quick intro. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Happy to be here. Thank you to Chris for the invite. And welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking about the AWS CLI, and the talk title here is Automate AWS with the CLI and Shell Scripting. My name is Wes Novack. I am a systems architect at Pluralsight. I have been using AWS for about 5 years, so I've got a little bit of experience there. And this talk is going to cover the CLI. We're going to go through the basics. So apologies if you use this every day. You're going to have to bear with me as I go through the getting started phase of using this. But I hope there's something in here for everyone as I move into the middle and the end of the talk to talk about some of the more advanced stuff that you can do with the CLI. So
are you doing AWS 1 or AWS 2? They recently released a new version of the CLI. Which one are you covering?
Yeah, this is covering the first CLI, not V2,
okay,
which has the nice AWS SSO integrations.
Just to let you know, the audience is across the board, Wes. There's beginners, there's intermediate, and there's advanced. So everybody will get something out of this.
Perfect. And I am going to have links at the end of this presentation, so don't feel like you need to try to copy, everything down or try to, note take on everything. Obviously, we're recording. So at the end, I'll have links to all of the source code that I demo in this presentation, along with my GitHub repo and links to other resources where you can learn more about everything that I'm talking about. So let's get going. Also, for the Q&A, let's save that to the end, just so that I can get through the presentation. And then, so please, I love questions, I love Q&A, but just save it for the end of the presentation, then we'll talk about those things. Thank you. So what is the AWS CLI? It is the command line interface, and it's a unified tool to manage your AWS services. That's straight from the source. So the really impressive thing about this is that AWS has dozens of services, maybe hundreds now, I don't even know, right? And all of these services have different product teams working on them with their own separate APIs. So to sort of combine them all into one command line tool that you can use to interface with all of those AWS services is powerful and impressive. So the first thing you're going to want to do to get started with the CLI is to install it, of course. And the recommended way to install the CLI is with pip. Pip installs packages. And so you're going to use this command on the screen here, pip install AWS CLI -- upgrade. We'll make sure you get the latest version, and -- user. We'll make sure that it installs for your user account. You don't need administrative privileges or sudo access if you use this -- user parameter. You're going to want to keep your CLI up to date because, as you may or may not know, AWS is good at releasing things. So there's new services being released every month, and even the existing services get new features, every month or so. It depends on the service, but things are always changing in AWS. So if you want to make sure that your CLI installed locally is able to interface with the new capabilities and the new services, you're going to want to run that upgrade command so that you get access to those new features. After you have the CLI installed, the first thing you're going to want to do is configure it. So you can use this AWS configure command to have this guided walkthrough of configuring your CLI. And you can use what they call a named profile if you have many different sets of AWS credentials. So this is very useful if you have multiple AWS accounts that you're working with. But even if you only have one account and you have multiple sets of credentials for an account, like a developer IAM user and an admin IAM user that you might want to switch between to see, test the different access between those different users or roles in one account, you might want to use these named profiles. So to use a named profile, when you're using that initial AWS configure command, you just use this -- profile command line option, and then you specify the named profile that you want to create or update. If you don't use that -- profile option, that's fine. It's just going to go ahead and set up a default profile. And that's also fine if you only have one AWS account or one set of credentials you want to use. You won't have to worry about the named profiles. But named profiles, again, are very powerful if you have multiple sets of credentials that you need to work with. So using this AWS configure command, it'll give you this guided walkthrough line by line. It's going to ask you for your AWS access key ID, your AWS secret access key, a default region name, a default output format, and then you hit enter and it's done, and it sets up that profile for you using this AWS configure command. So how do you get that access key ID and secret access key? Well, you're going to use the AWS Web Console, log in there, you go to your IAM user, and then on the security tab of your IAM user, there will be an option to generate an AWS access key. So you get the values for that access key ID and that secret access key, and you punch them in here when you're running your AWS configure command. You'll notice I mentioned IAM users a lot here. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. And so you're always going to want to use an IAM user with your CLI access. You're not going to want to use your AWS root user. When you originally create an AWS account, you provide AWS with an email, and they generate this root user that you can use to access your AWS account, but it's best practice to lock away that root user and not utilize it. Instead, they recommend you create an IAM user that you use that might have not full administrative capabilities like the root user has. So going on, after you have the AWS configure command run and you've fed in your access key ID and your secret access key, the AWS CLI generates a few config files for you where it stores the information that you provided in that AWS configure command. And so those config files are going to be located in this .aws directory that it creates in your home directory. And those files are going to be a config file and a credentials file. The config file is going to specify the default region and the output format for each named profile, or just a default profile if you have one set of credentials only. And then the credentials file is going to store the keys for each of your profiles. So one important thing to note here is this credentials file, it's going to store your secret access key in plain text on your file system. So knowing that this is the case, and this could be the keys to the kingdom for your AWS account, you're going to want to make sure that wherever you're running the AWS CLI, whether it's your notebook or a desktop or somewhere else, you want to make sure you use full disk encryption there so that this secret access key, which has the keys of the kingdom for your AWS account and can completely destroy it, or run up a massive bill is encrypted, and that somebody couldn't just pull your hard drive out of your machine and grab that secret access key ID if it was on an unencrypted disk. So keep that in mind. So if we look at these config files, the first one here is config. Again, I mentioned this is going to store things like the default region. You can see this is the format of the file here in this blue box on the screen. It's going to have different sections of the file that start with square brackets and the name of the profile that the configuration section applies to. So at the very top, you can see I've got one named default. And again, if you only have one set of credentials, you can use that default profile. But in this example here, my config file has a named profile for dev, one named stage, and one named prod. And you can see they can each have different default regions defined in that config file. So the other file was the credentials file, and this is going to store, again, your AWS access key ID and your secret access key. And that secret access key, again, is some of the most sensitive information you can have in regards to your AWS account, especially if these credentials are admin level credentials. But you can see here I've got a default profile, a dev named profile, and a stage named profile, each with their own set of keys and credentials. And yes, these are fake. So
I was just about to ask you, do you want me to blur those out?
Yep, oh, we're all good there. So this is what it's going to look like on your file system when you have configured your AWS CLI. Once you have this ready to go, you can start using the CLI. Before we start talking more about using the CLI, though, I want to talk about configuration settings and precedence. And this is a screenshot directly from the AWS documentation. And this talks about the order of operations or order of precedence for configuration values that you might use with the AWS CLI. So when you're using and running the AWS CLI, when you're running a command and a subcommand, the first thing it's going to use as the top most precedence in configuration values is going to be command line options. So if you run a command and you specify the option --region -US-west-2, for example, it's going to use that as the region no matter what. Nothing else can override that. But after those command line options comes environment variables. So you can also specify and set environment variables for your current shell or current environment that contain things like the access key ID and the secret access key and other things, and the region, all sorts of different things you can set in your environment variables if you want the CLI to look there. And those are the second order of precedence after the direct command line options. After that, it looks in the credentials file and the configuration file that we reviewed on the last couple of slides. After that, it looks at container credentials. Now, this is really only valid for things that are running in Amazon ECS, Elastic Container Service. And then after that, it will look at instance profile credentials. So when you launch an EC2 instance or virtual machine in AWS, you have the option to specify an instance profile that is mapped to a IAM role. And then you can set permissions on that IAM role to allow for anything that runs on that EC2 instance to have certain permissions in your AWS account. And this is the recommended way of providing credentials for an application or a script that runs on an EC2 instance. And the reason that it's the recommended way is because the AWS service will generate temporary credentials each time your app or your script on your EC2 instance reaches out to AWS. It'll just generate temporary credentials so that you don't have to hard code or specify an access key ID or a secret access key. You don't have to worry about rotating those credentials or those credentials leaking. They'll just always generate those credentials on the fly when the application needs it. So if you're doing things from an EC2 instance or a container, make sure to use a role or a profile to give the thing the access it needs inside your AWS account. So moving on, we talked about environment variables being that second order of precedence of configuration options. And in this example here, I'm doing an export of a environment variable named AWS_profile equals dev. And that would tell my CLI to use the named profile of dev for all commands that I run after this environment variable is set. And the only way to override that would be to use a command line option of --profile, some other named profile. But if you just wanted to have all of your subsequent commands use this named profile, you could set it as an environment variable, or you could set a default region as shown here on the second line. And this one is particularly helpful, and I've used this in some of my scripts before when I'm running a script that operates against multiple regions. So maybe you have a script that is 100 lines long. The first 50 lines are going to operate in your source region, and then you want to switch over to run a bunch more commands in a secondary region. Well, right before you start that second set of commands, you can do this export of the default region, and then all of your subsequent commands, in the second half of that script would execute by default against this secondary region. All right, moving on. So if you do use these name profiles and you have more than one, you need a way to switch between them. And so this example on my screen here is a shell function that I created that allows me to easily switch between name profiles. And you can see I've named this function SP, and that stands for switch profile. And looking at the function, really all it's doing is it's checking my AWS config file to see if the first positional parameter that I pass to this function actually exists in my config file. And then if it does, it's going to export the AWS profile environment variable to be equal to the first positional parameter that I have passed to this function, so that any subsequent commands that I run with AWS CLI after running this switch profile function will now use this new named profile that I've specified. So just a quick snippet of function I use to switch between those name profiles. This is going to be in the GitHub repository that I've linked at the end of this presentation. So you're free to use this if you think this would bring value to your command line interfacing. All right, so let's talk about some AWS CLI commands. And first we'll talk about the command format. So after you install the AWS CLI, you're going to get a binary named AWS. And after you specify that binary to execute, you're going to have some options that you can specify. And options include things like -- profile or -- region. Those are the command line options we talked about earlier in the precedence. Then you're going to have to specify a command, and this is the official AWS CLI vernacular. They call it a command and a subcommand, but a command is really an AWS service or an AWS API. You can think of it like that. And a subcommand is like a piece of functionality or a function in that API or on that service. So you've got to specify your AWS service as the command. The subcommand is going to be the thing you're going to want to do. And then there's going to be parameters. Some subcommands have required parameters. Other subcommands don't have any required parameters, but have optional parameters. And we'll look at a few examples of those after this too. So let's look at some examples. All right, so here we've got the AWS CLI invocation here. We're calling the EC2 command, the describe - instances subcommand. I'm using the -- instance - IDs parameter, which is an optional parameter on this describe - instances subcommand. And then I'm specifying a value of a gross looking EC2 instance ID there to make sure that I get the description of just that instance. Looking at another command here, I've got AWS, then I'm specifying an option of -- profile of prod. So I'm telling the CLI, again, let's just use this named profile of prod so that I activate those credentials for this CLI command, subcommand. I'm specifying a command of S3, a subcommand of LS. Next up, I've got AWS -- region option of US - east - 1, the command of RDS, and the subcommand of describe - DB - instances. And what this command is going to do is going to give you an output of the description of all of your RDS instances in the US East 1 region. Next up, I've got the AWS CLI calling the guard duty command, the list - findings subcommand. And here is an example of a subcommand that has a required parameter. So you have to specify -- detector - ID, some ID. And if you don't, it will happily give you some feedback that, hey, you're missing a required parameter here. And that's going to give me a response back of all of the findings for this detector in the AWS Guard Duty service. All right, last one. AWS ELB v2 command, create - load - balancer subcommand, and a required parameter of -- name my pretty ELB. All right, so now we can see what some of the AWS CLI commands look like. That's great. And this is definitely going to be overview for those of you that have used the CLI already. When you're using the CLI, how do you get help? Well, it's pretty simple. You just type out AWS command help or AWS command subcommand help. And that will give you some verbose man-style information on what subcommands are available. If you're doing a help after a command, like the S3 help here, it's going to tell you all the different subcommands that are available underneath S3. Or if you're doing a help on a subcommand, it's going to give you all information on all of the required parameters, if there are any, and all of the optional parameters so that you actually know how to use this subcommand. But don't use -- help, which I try to do, pretty much every other day, and because that won't work. So they don't use the, Unix or Linux utility syntax of -- help, which we're probably all used to. You just have to use help without any hyphens in front of it here. All right, so the AWS CLI typically returns information or a response for the command that you're attempting to run in a JSON format. So you can see here I've got, I know it's really small text, but this is a JSON response from the AWS command, the EC2 command, describe - instances subcommand, and it's listing out a whole boatload of information about one EC2 instance. And there's so much information that I couldn't even fit it all on the one slide here, but this gives you the gist that you can get a very large amount of information returned back from AWS on some of these commands. So if you only need one particular value or piece of information out of these very large responses, then you're going to need to do something else to just work with the particular information that you need. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit here on how you can do that with your scripting. Okay, so we covered the basics. Now let's talk about the good stuff. We're going to talk about -- filter option. We're going to talk about -- query, which uses JMESPath query language. If any of you have used the JQ utility, it's the exact same query language that -- query for the AWS CLI uses. It's its own query language. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we might use that in our scripting. And -- output is another option that you can use. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, the default output is JSON, but if you need to output in different formats like text, just raw text, or a table, you can do that with this -- output option. We're going to talk about shell scripting, command substitution, which uses this syntax of $parentheses. And then we're going to talk about bash functions as well. So let's move along there. So -- filter. This is a command line option that allows you to, as the name suggests, filter the response that you get from AWS. So in this case, we're using that EC2 command, the describe - instances subcommand, and we're using the -- filter option to tell AWS we only want information back on the tag with the name of name that contains the value of your - instance - name. So if you had an EC2 instance that you knew what you named it in terms of the name tag, but you didn't know the EC2 instance ID, you didn't know the IP address, you didn't know anything else about the EC2 instance, you just knew the name, you could use this filter command to tell the AWS CLI to return you information about just that instance instead of getting information returned about every single one of your EC2 instances in the region that you're targeting right here. So filter is helpful, but it has one major problem. And the major problem is that every AWS service has to explicitly build in support for filter. And so that doesn't always happen. And that means that filter is supported by some AWS commands and subcommands, really. Some subcommands have really robust support for filter, so that you can filter on just about any attribute for a particular AWS object. But other subcommands have almost no support for filter. Maybe they have the option to filter on just one piece of information, but not another piece of information that you wanted to filter on. But that's okay because I almost never use filter. I use query most of the time because -- query can do filtering, and you can use it on every single AWS subcommand because query is really operating on the JSON response. It's not requiring the AWS service or the AWS API to have support for filtering. You're doing the filter yourself on the JSON response that you receive back from AWS. So in this example here on the slide I'm currently displaying, we've got the EC2 command, the describe-instances subcommand. I'm using an optional parameter for that subcommand for --instance-IDs. And I've got a big, long, ugly EC2 instance ID that I am telling the EC2 describe-instances subcommand to return information just on that one EC2 instance. And then I'm using this --query command line option to dive into the JSON response that I'm going to get back from AWS. And I'm telling it here to dive down in from the top level reservations key into the instances key, and then only return the private IP address information out of the very, very large response that we saw in one of the previous slides for EC2 information, describe instances. There's so much information there. If you only want the private IP address, you can use JMESPath query language and this -- query option to pull out just the piece of information you want. And in this case, again, I'm just pulling out the private IP address of the EC2 instance. All right, so filtering with query. So again, as we talked about earlier, filter is great, but it's not always built to support the thing you want to do with it. So you can also do filtering with query. So in this case, I'm using the RDS command, the describe-db-instances subcommand. I've got the -- query option here, command line option, and I'm telling it to operate on that response I'm getting back from AWS to dive into the DB instances top level JSON key. And then I'm telling it to do a filter here using this question mark syntax inside of the square brackets here. I'm telling it to only return information for DB instances that have this auto minor version upgrade attribute set to true. So anything that is any of my DB instances that don't have auto minor version upgrade set to true are not going to get returned to me in my response. And then again, to the right of that, I've got .db instance identifier, and that's telling AWS to only return, or I'm sorry, not AWS, but it's telling the query, JMES query language here, to only return that piece of information, the DB instance identifier. So what this is going to get me when I run this command is going to get me a list containing all of the DB instance identifiers, just the RDS instance IDs of all of my instances that have auto minor version upgrade turned on. And it won't, and you could do the opposite, right? You could set that to false there, and then you'd have a list of all of the RDS instances in the region you're targeting that don't have auto minor version upgrade turned on. So you can see how that could be useful. Okay, so JMESPath also has functions. It's like this whole JMESPath query language. So you can use functions in your queries as well to do more with your response and more data manipulation here. So in this example here, I'm using the EC2 command, describe-instances subcommand. I'm using the option for region US West 2. I'm doing a filter on the owner ID. And this is a good example that you can combine both filter and query to do even more powerful things. But you really don't even need filter here, but this is just an example of combining them both, because typically you can do everything with query. But here I'm using both of them. And so in the query section, I'm telling this JMESPath query language to dive into the images key, so all the information underneath that images key in the JSON response object. And then I'm using this question mark starts underscore with function. And this function takes 2 parameters, and those parameters are specified here in this example as image location and then a string. So what I'm doing here with this particular JMESPath function is that I'm filtering only on the objects underneath that images key that have their image location attribute that starts with this string. So in this particular example, I'm interested in all of the AMIs, or Amazon Machine Images, that start with this string, which indicates that it's a Ubuntu Xenial 1604 AMI. And then I'm piping the response I'm piping the result of that to another function even, and that's the sort underscore by function you can see here in green. And that takes two parameters, the array that you're going to sort, and then what attribute you're going to sort by. The @ symbol there is just the array that was piped into the function here, and then it's telling it to sort by the image location. I'm piping that to this -1 here, which says get the last item off of that list, and then I'm piping that to image ID, which is telling it just to return the value of the image ID, and I'm outputting as text. So that's a lot. I know I've said a lot of things there, and they might just sound like crazy words, but what this whole big thing is doing here is essentially querying AWS to find all of the AMIs for this version of Ubuntu, and then it's returning the latest version of the AMI. So if you had some kind of host rotation policy where you spun up new hosts on a quarterly basis or an annual basis or whatever it is you might want to do, and you always wanted to make sure you found the latest AMI for a particular OS version, this is one way to do it. All right, moving on, filter plus query. And I talked about this already, so I think I could probably skip over this, but you can combine filter and query together. But oftentimes, if you get really good at query and JMESPath query language, you're probably not going to need to combine them both. But if it's easier to combine them both, you can, and you're welcome to do so. But again, remember that the filter has limitations. Not all subcommands support filter, and they might not support the attribute that you want to filter on. And then you could also output, and I talked about this a little bit earlier as well. If you don't want to return output from your AWS CLI command, a JSON response, you can output as text instead, or as a table, or there might be a few other options. All right, let's talk about command substitution. This is something that I use heavily in all of my scripts that I leverage with the AWS CLI. Command substitution allows you essentially to set a shell variable to the result of a command. And that's why it's called command substitution. In this example here, I've got a variable named IP_address that I'm setting to the result of the command within the dollar parentheses. And that command happens to be an AWS CLI call, where I'm calling the command EC2, the describe-instances subcommand. I'm specifying an instance ID, and then I'm using that JMESPath query language here again to pull out just the private IP address for that particular EC2 instance. I'm outputting it as text, and then what that's going to do is set the value of that IP_address to the result of that command. And then you're going to get something like this when you echo out the value of that variable, just a nice text representation of the value of the private IP address attribute on that EC2 instance. All right, moving on, positional parameters. So when you're using AWS, sorry, not AWS, but just general bash shell scripting, when you're using shell scripts and shell functions, it uses this concept of positional parameters. So in this example here, I'm showing a shell script named your_script.sh. So this is going to be your script name or function name when you're calling it from the shell or command line. And then after that, you're going to have a positional parameter if you provide one. So when you call a shell script or a shell function, if you use a space and then specify something else, it's going to set that as the first positional parameter and store that in a variable named $1. And if you set an additional one, it'll store that as a second positional parameter named $2, and so on. So if you need to pass additional parameters into a shell function or a shell script, you can do so in this way using positional parameters. Okay, so covered the basics there. So let's talk about writing some functions that include the AWS CLI. So here is an example of a shell function that I have named getID_from_name. And inside this shell function, the function body is in between the curly braces here. First thing I'm going to do here is set a variable named ID equal to the command substitution result of an AWS CLI command. In this case, it's the EC2 command describe-instances subcommand. what I'm going to do is filter on the name tag of an EC2 instance that has the value of $1. So remember, $1 is the first positional parameter. So if you know the name of your EC2 instance and you wanted to get the EC2 instance ID, you could use this shell function and you'd pass the name after get ID from name. So you would, on the command line, you would write get ID from name space your instance name. It's going to set that instance name as the filter here, and then it's going to use the -- query command line option to just return the instance ID attribute of that EC2 instance. It's going to output it as text so that it sets it well when it's setting that ID variable, and then it's going to echo that ID variable afterwards so that you'll get the output of that EC2 instance ID. So I use stuff like this all the time in my use of AWS and the AWS CLI, because oftentimes you don't memorize the crazy long EC2 instance ID names, right? Like they're crazy. So you might know the name, you might know the IP address, or you might want to get the EC2 instance ID, you might want to get the IP address. But the reason I set this to an ID variable instead of only just echoing it out or just providing the output is that oftentimes I'm going to want to do something with that ID after I get it. Like I might want to restart the EC2 instance once I have the ID. And a lot of the other EC2 subcommands require you to pass in the EC2 instance ID as a required parameter. So that's why I set it as the ID variable so that it's still available in subsequent commands that I might want to run. Okay, let's script it. So I'm going to go into a quick demo here to show what it might look like to use some of these concepts that I've been talking about here. So let's jump. Oh, and I've got the Ninja Turtles because we're shell scripting, right? I love the Ninja Turtle. They're
Oh, dad jokes.
That's right. Hashtag dad jokes. So let's jump in and take a look at what you might do with some of these concepts that I've talked about here. All right, so here I've got a script named stop_start_ec2.sh. So this is a shell script to stop and then start an EC2 instance. First thing I do here is use the set-e command here to exit the script if we get any non-zero status codes returned for any of my commands. So if anything fails, I want to exit the script. That's the first thing I do here. Then I set a couple variables. You can see I set ID equal to $1, which is going to be the first positional parameter that I pass into the script when I'm calling the script. I've got a constant here of 5. I'm just setting a sleep duration of 5 for when I'm doing some things later in the script. And then I'm just capturing the start time using that command substitution, calling the date utility there just so that I know when the script started. I can calculate when it ended, and then I can calculate the total time of the script later at the end and then output it. Here I've got a function named check_parameter. And what this function is doing is some input validation, essentially. So it's doing a check to see if a first positional parameter was actually passed. And if it was passed, let's grep it and make sure it actually looks like an EC2 instance ID, because that's what I'm expecting here. So you can see here I've got a grep expression here that has some regex here that's expecting an EC2 instance ID to contain alphanumeric characters of 8 or more after I dash, right? So if that is all successful, then we know we got the parameter we were expecting for this script to work, and we return a 0. That means the script can continue. We got the input we're expecting for the script. If it does not work, we enter the else block here, and then we're going to echo out to the user that an instance ID parameter is required and give them an example of what an instance ID looks like. It's going to return 1, and because of our set-e above, that's going to exit the script. All right, moving down. Let's look at some of these other functions. So remember, again, we're just trying to stop and then start an EC2 instance here. Next function is stop_instance. What this is going to do is call the AWS CLI EC2 command, stop-instances subcommand. It's going to use that --instance-IDs optional parameter, and then use that $1 positional parameter that we passed into the script, and we're also going to pass it into the function to tell it which instance to stop. We're doing the same thing right under it, but this is a start instance command instead of a stop instance command, so it's very similar. Next function here is a check_status function. So this function is going to run the EC2 command describe-instances subcommand. We're specifying the --instance IDs, optional parameter there, and then we're using that --query, JMESPath query language to pull out the state.name attribute of the instance and output it as text. So an EC2 instance can be in various states. It can be running, it can be stopping, it can be starting, it could be stopped. That's what we're doing there with the check status. We're getting the state of it. Next function here is check_running. So we're in this function, we're calling the function above, and we're outputting that into the status variable. So we want to get the current state of a particular instance, stuff it into the status variable, and then we're going to enter into this if statement here that says if the status is not equal to running, then we can't restart the instance because its state is not running. So with this script, we expect the EC2 instance to already be running. And so if we find that it's not running, we're going to return an error code of 1 or return code of 1, and that's going to exit the script because, again, we had that set-e at the top of the script here. All right. So as we continue on down the script here, our next function is going to be the wait for status function. And this is where a lot of the magic of the script happens, because the wait for status function here allows us to wait until an EC2 instance enters the status that we want it to be in. So the first thing we do is, again, we set a status variable equal to the command substitution result of our check status function above. And again, remember that status is going to equal running, stopping, starting, or stopped. And then we've got a while loop here. And you can see here we're saying while the status is not equal to $2, we enter into this while loop. So this function expects 2 positional parameters to be passed to it. So while your status is not equal to your second positional parameter, it's going to know that the instance state has not yet entered into the state you want it to be in, and it's going to sleep. And it's going to sleep for sleep duration. And again, here I'm just highlighting the different positional parameters that this particular function requires. So if you pass it wait for status down below, you can see I passed it instance ID and then a status of stopped. It's going to enter that while loop, and it's going to continue checking that EC2 instance until its status is actually equal to stopped. So that while loop just continues to execute, including a sleep of 5 seconds so that it doesn't overwhelm the EC2 API. It's just going to keep checking that instance and wait for it to be stopped. If it's not stopped again, it's, going to keep executing through that loop. So this is a way to, pull the AWS API using the EC2 CLI until a instance enters into the status you want it to be in. So down here in the bottom is like the main execution. I should probably wrap this in like a main function and call the main function at the bottom of the script here. But this is where all of that gets executed. So the first thing we do is call that check parameter function. The second thing we do is we check running. We see if the EC2 instance is actually in a running state. Next, we do a stop instance. Then we do a wait for status of stopped, right? So the previous command we did here was we told the instance to stop, and then we enter into that while loop and we keep checking the instance until it is stopped. Then we start the instance, and then we wait for status of running, because when we issue that start command, it takes some amount of time for that instance to actually come online and enter the running state again. And then we calculate the end time and a duration, and we echo out some information to the user on how long it took and that their instance ID restart is now complete. All right, so if we had to do all that manually, let's take a look at what that looks like from the AWS Web Console's point of view. And this is just to illustrate why the CLI is much preferred. Because when you do this from the web console, you're going to have to select your EC2 instance. You go to Actions, you go to Instance State. You're going to have to click Stop. And then AWS is always going to prompt you, are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Double check yourself before you wreck yourself. And that's super annoying if you know what you want to do. You don't want AWS to keep asking you over and over, are you sure you want to do that? right? And then again, as we talked about, once you issue that stop command, the state is going to turn to a stopping state, but its final state that you want it to be in is stopped, because you can't start it back up until it's stopped. So there's going to be this period of stopping of state. The EC2 instance is going to be this stopping state. And in the AWS Web Console, you're going to have to just keep hammering this refresh button and keep watching it. Keep hitting refresh here. Is it in the stopped state yet? Nope, still stopping. Well, I guess I got to click that refresh button again. Because let's say this is like a critical host that you can't have down for a long time. You know, let's say you have a really bad design and you only have a single instance that's hosting a piece of functionality here. And you're stopping this instance for whatever reason, and then you're going to start it back up. Maybe there was a EC2 instance degradation, right? You have to stop it and then start it to move it new hardware. Well, you can see here, I'm clicking this refresh button in the console. It's still in the stopping state. This is taking forever. Oh, finally, look, finally it entered stopped. But it's not going to start up automatically for you. Now you got to go back to actions. You got to find the sub menu here for instance state. Click on start. Are you really sure you want to start this thing? AWS is going to prompt you again. Make sure you really want to start it. And then you're going to have to click that yes start button. And then once again, the state of the instance enters into this pending state. And then you're going to want to, again, click this refresh button here over and over and over until it reaches this running state. This is the final state you wanted it to be in. So it's, you know, it's a good observation to note that this takes a lot of work on your part to do it through the web console, right? Like you have to be at your desk, you have to be watching this thing, you have to keep clicking refresh, you have to wait for it to get into the stop state, and then click you know, the sub menus and the option, the confirmations to start it again if you want to get it started back up. So that's super annoying. That takes too much work. I don't like it. I'd use the CLI. So what does that look like on the CLI versus using the web console? Well, let's take a look. So that script we just looked at, let's execute that. First, I'm going to use that get ID from name function that we looked at earlier to get the instance ID, right? So I got the instance ID using get ID from name. And then I'm going to call my reboot underscore EC2 .sh shell script here, passing the instance ID as the first positional parameter. And it's going to start by stopping the instance. Well, it does a bunch of other things first that we talked about, right? It's going to do some input validation, then it's going to make sure the instance is running. But when you pass all that, it's going to issue the stop EC2 instance command. Then it's going to enter that while loop that we talked about when we were looking at the script code here. So you can see here it's going to output some information to the user here. The instance state is not yet stopped. So I'm going to sleep for 5 seconds, then I'm going to check it again. I'm going to keep checking that instance until it stopped. Okay, look, it stopped. Great. So now that it's stopped, we're happy, and the script just continues on. You don't have to click refresh in the web console. It just knows, like, I can proceed to the next part of my script. So now I'm going to start it. And then we enter into that while loop again, and it says the instance state is not yet running. So I'm going to sleeping, checking to see when that EC2 instance is running. So, you know, if you contrast this with the way to do this in the web console, with this way of doing it, you know, you can go get a coffee or something. You know, the script's going to do all the work for you, right? You don't have to sit there and hammer on the refresh button and, you know, maybe exceed the API rate limiting of the web console or something dumb like that. And then at the end of the script here, you can see finally the instance entered the running state. So the loop was exited, and we output some information for the script. It says your restart of the instance is complete, and the script completed in 64 seconds. Great. Okay, so that is the end of my demo and my discussion around the CLI and shell scripting, but there is a couple other things I wanted to mention, which I would be remiss if I did not mention. There is this thing called the AWS Shell, but this is one of those like buyer beware type situations, because this thing has been in like beta for like 5 years or something like that. And like they've never promoted it to GA, but it's still a thing out there and you can use it. So if you are interested in getting things like autocomplete for subcommands and autocomplete for resource IDs and things like that, you might want to check out the AWS Shell. So that's available from Amazon. You can download it and use it, but it never got out of beta to my knowledge. So it's one of those like use at your own risk kind of things. It sort of annoys me because I'm used to using the CLI and always typing AWS, but with AWS Shell, you don't have to type AWS. You just type the command and then the subcommand. But you can see here in the example, I've got a drop down of different subcommands that are available on the EC2 command. So it's got some things that are interesting, but I don't use it myself. Just wanted to mention that this thing exists and you might want to check it out. All right, so on to suggestions. I recommend using a completely separate and isolated AWS account to dev and test your CLI scripts. You don't want to delete your entire production fleet by accident as you're learning how to script, right? So use a different named profile, maybe even delete your production profile completely off your machine if you're doing some testing with some scripts, and you want to make sure that you don't cause any production issues or catastrophic outages, etc. Never put your AWS keys on hosts or in apps. Use instant profiles and roles instead. I touched on that a little bit earlier when I talked about instance profiles and instance roles. Rotate your keys regularly. So every quarter, depends on your risk profile, but it's a good idea to rotate the AWS access keys that are attached to IAM users at some interval. I've actually written and created a process at my company that scans all of our AWS accounts and the keys in those accounts attached to IAM users. And if the keys don't have any usage within a particular time period, then it just automatically disables the keys on that IAM user and posts a notification to Slack to alert everybody that, hey, these keys haven't been used, so they've been disabled. Encrypt your notebook and desktop drives, and that goes back to the point that the AWS CLI is going to put your secret access key in a plain text file on your drive. So you don't want that being exposed, so please encrypt your drives. All right, other notables. You can check your version with AWS --version. Again, you can upgrade with pip install --upgrade AWS CLI. You can even turn on history for the CLI with AWS configure set CLI_history enabled. So if you want to be able to view all of your past CLI commands, you can do that by turning on the history here. And then you can access the history of commands with AWS history list after you've turned on that CLI history. All right, I've got some image sources here in the presentation and additional resources as well if you want to read up more on the CLI, config precedence, JMESPath, AWS Shell, a couple of Pluralsight courses here that cover the command line interface and Bash Shell scripting. And you can download this. So here is the GitHub repository where I have stored the functions and the scripts that I've demoed in this presentation, along with additional functions and scripts that I use with the CLI regularly. Things like deleting IAM users are surprisingly difficult. You have to find all of the groups that a person is a member of. You have to delete their MFA first. You have to delete their login profile first. There's a whole huge batch of things you have to do to delete an IAM user. So you probably want to script that out with a bunch of different functions. And that is available in that repo as well. If you want to download this presentation that I've given here, this slide deck, you can do that at the URL here, the Google, rest in peace, the Google link shortener, no longer available to us, but I've got a legacy
Hello, is this locked up? I don't hear anything. Hello?
Hey, Chris, are you talking on mute?
I was talking on mute. It looks like Wes froze up for a second there. Hopefully he'll come back for Q&A.
Just as he said, I've got a legacy.
Yeah, a legacy link into the old Google shortener.
He dropped the mic. I think he just dropped the mic and left.
He's out. I'm out. Peace out. All right. Well,
So maybe I'm sure he'll join back.
Yeah, I'll ping him. Well, actually, that's a good segue. For everybody that's still in the call, please check in the chat and go to the awspug.survey. Tonight we are giving away. Oh, and here he's back.
I'm back. My Zoom crashed.
Yay. We heard everything up to legacy, Google URL shortener, and then
Google didn't like that.
yeah, they heard you, and they were very upset. They were like, "I'll teach you how to have a legacy shortener."
Yeah, they got mad at me. Do we need? I guess I could just post those URLs in the chat here because my presentation was basically done. So let me just post those in the chat. And we can,
if you put the presentation or the URLs in the chat, then what I'll do is when I post it on YouTube, I'll also have them in the show notes in there as well. So that would be awesome. Instead of me like going to the video and typing out the URLs. So for everybody else, please click on awspug.org/survey and fill out the survey. Mr. Planky, what are we giving away tonight?
I think tonight it's two $25 AWS credits. So when you guys get in there, you start your scripting and you accidentally turn on an EC2 instance and forget to turn it off. Hopefully this can cover a little bit of that because we know it won't cover the whole thing. But we do have 2 of those to go out tonight. And so as long as you guys fill out the survey, we will enter you in that drawing. And we'll give folks a couple of minutes here to fill out that survey. And then we will spin a wheel. It'll be very interactive, very fun. And we will pick our winners here tonight.
Normally how we do it, Wes, is we have the presenter. So we'll have everybody like write up a little piece of paper with you know, the yay, thumbs up, or boo, thumbs down, and then we gather them all together with the email address and whatnot at the end, and the presenter gets to draw from the pile or the hat or whatever to pick the winners from the evening sponsor. Unfortunately, we've had to automate the entire process, so we've automated you out of a job with a simple shell script, and now we have a Wheel of Fortune style presentation. Our own Vanna White, Chris Planky, spins the wheel, and we pick somebody from the digital hat.
That's great. Hey, we didn't get a chance to do Q&A, so should we do that now, or what did you prefer?
I think we should, as long as there's no technical support questions in the Q&A. So yeah, if anybody has any questions for Wes, speak now.
Let's hear. I actually do have a question. Can you speak to any differences between AWS CLI V1 and V2? I've heard there's a lot of improvements in V2, like with single sign-on and some additional functionality with V2.
Yeah, so I haven't used V2 much yet, but I know that one of the key features of it is that it natively supports generating temporary credentials based on AWS SSO. So at my work, we're currently working on an initiative to integrate Okta with AWS and use Okta credentials with all the things. There's some really interesting work going on between Okta and AWS SSO, but that's the main draw of AWS CLI V2 that I've heard, is that it has the native SSO credentials support. So I haven't used it much myself, so I can't say much further, but I'm definitely.
Yeah, I haven't either. I've just dabbled, so that was also one of the main draws I've heard as well. Thanks.
Nice. Yep.
Yes, a question here. I'm looking. When I'm trying to do an S3 notification and use a generate CLI, it generates skeleton CLI, it creates a JSON for you, right? Which you can pass as an input to, you can use a JSON as instead of all those command lines. Have you had any success in using that? Using a prefix and a suffix.
Sorry, I'm not 100% clear on what your question is.
So on S3, right? On a S3 bucket,
yep,
you can put a notification, and the notification could have a prefix and a suffix, right? So like on a key, like say /AWS Portsmouth is the like folder. And within that, I want to say star.mp3 or star.jpg, right? Whenever a file is with a star.jpg is loaded, run a Lambda function. So I've been trying to look at the manual and see whether that. I'm just asking, have you had any luck on that?
I haven't done that specific thing with the AWS CLI, and one thing that I didn't mention as part of my presentation is that I recommend that most things you do in AWS happen via infrastructure as code, like using Terraform or CloudFormation or pick your poison. CLI should really just be used for things that maybe aren't defined as infrastructure as code or don't have a process defined with infrastructure as code in mind, or maybe emergency maintenances or reboots or things like that. But for things like setting up a S3 notification trigger, I would recommend that you define that in infrastructure as code if that's going to be a persistent thing. But I could look into the CLI options to do that. I'd be happy to do that for you and get back to you if you'd like.
Can we send you on a message on Twitter? How could we reach out to you?
Yeah, that's the best way to get me. Yeah, just send me a message on Twitter, and I'd be happy to look into that for you. No worries.
Thank you.
Hey, Wes, I'm sorry, I do have a question for Wes, if that's all right here. Any password managers that you know of or can recommend for working with the AWS CLI? I know you mentioned with the config file, it's stored in plain text, and that's something to be mindful of. I believe I've heard of some password managers that kind of help you manage this. Is there anything that you've used or can recommend to use or avoid for that matter?
No, I actually haven't really researched that. What have you found? You said you've heard of a couple, or have you used a couple?
I used 1Password, and I don't think it has an AWS integration, but I was on a web call that Chris Williams hosted for vBrownBag, and one of the people there had a password manager, one of the free open source ones, and it had some CLI integrations so that you could basically use your regular password manager and pick your profiles, which I assume were stored in that password manager. So I was just curious if that's anything that you've played around with or had any recommendations, but I don't know the exact one.
I haven't tested any of those myself, but what comes to mind for me is that if any of those password managers did have CLI interfaces, you could use those to extract your keys and stuff them into environment variables, and then destroy those environment variables when you're done. For me, as I mentioned, we're moving to Okta, which means no IAM users and no permanent AWS access keys. So we're using and evaluating various utilities. There's one called AWS _Okta _keyman that allows you to authenticate to Okta via the CLI, and then it exports an AWS access key and secret access key into your environment variables that you can use just temporarily. They have an expiration, and so then you don't have to store a long-lived or permanent set of AWS access keys. You just use the temporary ones that are generated based on your SSO credentials at runtime.
Yeah.
So that's what we're moving towards, so that we wouldn't have to manage the storage of those. For our pass manager, we use LastPass in my work. I use Bitwarden at home. So whatever you're interested in and whatever might have an integration. I haven't really looked into that.
Have you guys heard of AWS Vault, which basically it's an open source software, which on your PC it exposes your machine like a EC2 data service, and if you have STS things on your role, it gives you temporary credentials. So it's like almost having an on-prem EC2 with the temporary credentials.
Yeah, I actually had some folks on my team use that before, but I don't use that one heavily. But yeah, that's a good call out. That might be worth checking out.
Nice. Okay. Mr. Planky, do we have a quorum of submissions?
Yes, let me see here. So we have 15 submissions. I think we had 20 something on the call.
We had 29. Come on, doesn't everybody want $25? What's going on here?
So
make me turn into a potato. I will do it.
I thought it was not.
I think that's the best message that you're supposed to see once you submit, because I just get like a blank screen and there's like a console error.
Oh, that doesn't sound particularly great.
Chris, how did you do that?
I'm sorry, how to do what?
Become a potato.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I want to know too.
You just said that you want to become a potato, right?
It's a thing called Snap Camera, And what you can do is you can change yourself into all kinds of things. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, I know what I'm doing now.
Can I
You guys,
throw one last question now? Oh, I'm sorry. You're in the middle of doing the.
no, absolutely. Please ask.
I just was wondering if Wes had like a go-to like set of favorite CLI commands that he finds himself using over and over.
So a lot of it depends. Like it's really just going to depend on what services you use the most, right? Like if you got a lot of EC2 instances, you're probably going to want to use a lot of the EC2 subcommands, and that's where a lot of those functions. One of them I showcased in the presentation was the get ID from name. I've got like 5 or 6 different functions in the GitHub repo that basically allow you to quickly get one piece of information about an EC2 instance if you have another piece of information. So I use those a lot. But if you're not doing EC2, in your AWS account, it just depends what services you're using on. Like if you're doing all Lambdas and not using EC2, and then you're probably going to use Lambda related CLI commands, right?
Sorry, one thing was not explicitly called out, but sort of mentioned. Some people use multi-factor authentication. I don't want just the username and password, but I also want your Google Auth on your phone. Other thing, and there's some scripts you can run. So maybe if I'm logging on a console, I'll hit my phone and give me a code, and I'll type it in. But there's some scripts on the GitHub. So I want to do the CLI thing. So it'll prompt you for the same challenge you're getting on your phone or whatever thing you use for multi-factor auth. But that's the thing too that you might want to, depending on how your organization runs. I'm thinking of. You froze.
Yeah, Mark, that's a great point. Yeah, if you do have an IAM policy in your organization that requires MFA, that's going to require you to do things a little bit differently with the CLI. So you can enforce MFA even for the CLI in your AWS account for your users. And when you have that enforcement, what it's going to look like on the CLI is you're going to try to do something and you're going to get an access denied message. So there is no like native way to do MFA on the CLI. The CLI really just supports that by looking at particular environment variables. So you're going to have to use
environment variables. And another thing for most of us, but it's a good thing to have. Like if you don't do this, you should maybe think about doing it, or maybe not. I don't know. Depending on how you do the role.
Mark, you're still breaking up a little bit there, but I think you got the gist of it. Yeah, I also recommend, doing MFA enforcement for the CLI. We do that at my work too. And that means you're going to either have to write your own script or, use a script that you find on GitHub that allows you to do MFA on the command line so that it will export the necessary temporary credentials that indicate that you have MFA'd on the command line. That sort of exports a new access key, a new secret key, new access key, a session token, and all this other stuff that you're going to need stuffed into your environment variables to get the higher level of access on the CLI.
Wes, is there any, somebody mentioned to me, but I'm not yet been able to find this out on the CLI. Can you simulate reduced bandwidth? Like I want to run the CLI on say 2400 baud, or 9600 baud, see how we had a situation like Mark, right? His video looked like he's on 2400 or 1200 baud.
Yeah, no, I'm not familiar with any of that type of capability that the CLI has. I don't think it offers that.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Okay. Mr. Plankley, do we have a drawing?
Yes. So I will share my screen out here. I hope you guys see the right one. You guys see the wheel?
Yep. I'm gonna stop the recording now so that we don't have to clip it out at the end.
Oh, so I switched it up this week. I put numbers to represent the rows, and I have the emails on a different monitor. I've learned.
You are so clever.
Yeah. So you guys are gonna have to trust me with the mapping behind the scenes here, but pretty good with ones and zeros. It's gonna be the other numbers that throw me off. So going to click to spin. This is way more exciting for me than you, I bet. And number 5. So, oh, there's sound. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Very exciting.
We can hear it, yeah.
J Disum. I have your emails. I'll be able to email you guys after this. So no worries if I butchered that. We will make sure you get your code.
Congratulations, Jay. Yay.
Yeah, nice.
From the avocado down there. All right. So let me spin it again.
At first, I thought this was a Google sheet, and I was very impressed. I was like, wow.
So there's a Google sheet that I have all the entries in behind the scenes, but this is, I don't know, this is just some online tool here. So number 14 was their email started with SMA. So if that is you, congratulations. I will be emailing you a $25 code.
Congratulations, SMA.
Nice job.
Cool.
Nice, thank you so much.
From
for
potato
coming
to Wonder Man, right? No, Superman.
I don't know who that is. I'm not sure. Oh well. Cool. All right. Wes, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I definitely appreciate it. we're definitely not as polished as some of the larger groups.
No worries, man. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Cool. All right. Well, folks, thanks for coming out tonight. I'll put this up on the YouTube channel, and we'll get the show notes and the URLs in there as well. Once again, thanks to Wes. If you want to, sync up with him, he's Wesley Tech on Twitter, and I'll put all that information on there as well. So cool. All right, folks. Well, have a great night. I'm gonna go get that beer that I wanted to get.
Hey, Chris, you left Green Pages, right? Now, where are you?
Hold on, let me stop the recording.
Right.